Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever finished something, a project, a presentation, a difficult conversation, a year of extraordinary effort, and felt in the moment of completion, not relief or pride or satisfaction, but a brief, hollow pause followed immediately by the anxious identification of what wasn't quite right? What could have been better? What someone might criticize? What you need to improve before the next time? And have you noticed that the anxiety that was driving the work doesn't actually resolve when the work is done? That the standard moves the moment you reach it? That the relief you are working toward never fully arrives? If that resonates, you are not experiencing two separate problems, a perfectionism problem and an anxiety problem, that happen to coexist. You are caught in a single, integrated, self-reinforcing cycle, the perfectionism and anxiety habit loop. And it is one of the most exhausting, most insight-resistant, and most widely misunderstood psychological patterns that clinicians encounter. Today, we are mapping it completely. What a habit loop is, how perfectionism and anxiety each contribute to it, how they lock together into a cycle that runs on autopilot, regardless of how much you understand it intellectually, where it shows up in daily life, and, most importantly, what the research says actually breaks it. The worksheet that maps this cycle for your specific experience is linked in the description. Let's start with the mechanism. Section 1. What a habit loop actually is. The concept of the habit loop comes from the neuroscience of habit formation, most popularly articulated by Charles Duhigg and grounded in decades of research on the basal ganglia, the brain region most responsible for the automatic habitual patterns that govern large portions of human behavior. A habit loop has three components. The first is the cue, the trigger that initiates the loop. This can be a specific situation, an emotional state, a physical sensation, a time of day, or any other stimulus that the brain has learned to associate with the behavior that follows. The second component is the routine, the behavior itself, the automatic response that the cue activates. And the third component is the reward, the neurological payoff that the brain registers at the completion of the routine, which reinforces the connection between cue and routine and makes the entire loop more likely to repeat. The critical feature of habits, the one that makes them so powerful and so difficult to change through willpower alone, is that they are neurologically efficient. The basal ganglia runs habitual sequences without engaging the prefrontal cortex, the deliberate, effortful, reasoning part of the brain. Habits, once established, run on autopilot. The brain has essentially said, this sequence is reliable enough that I don't need to think about it anymore. And having delegated the sequence to automatic processing, it genuinely does not require conscious engagement to execute. This is why insight is insufficient to break a habit loop. You can understand the loop completely, can describe every element of it with clinical precision, and still find yourself in the middle of it before the prefrontal cortex has had the chance to intervene. The loop doesn't run through understanding, it runs through the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is not impressed by insight. What this means for perfectionism and anxiety is significant. The cycle between them is not primarily a thinking pattern. It is a habit, a neurologically ingrained automatic sequence with a cue, a routine, and a reward. And the intervention that works is not the one that produces more insight into the loop, but the one that disrupts the routine at the right moment, consistently enough, and with a compelling enough alternative reward that the basal ganglia begins to learn a new sequence. Section 2. The anxiety side of the loop. Anxiety is the emotional activation that drives the perfectionism and anxiety habit loop, the fuel that keeps the engine running. And understanding specifically what anxiety is doing in this cycle is essential for understanding why the loop is so self-perpetuating. At the neurobiological level, anxiety activates the threat detection system, the amygdala, which responds to perceived threat by mobilizing the stress response. Cortisol and adrenaline, narrowed attention, heightened vigilance, and the urgency to do something to resolve the threat. The threat in perfectionism-driven anxiety is not a physical predator. It is the threat of failure, criticism, exposure, or the loss of the conditional love or approval that perfectionism learned, early on, was contingent on performing well. In the perfectionism anxiety loop, anxiety functions primarily as the cue, the initiating trigger that sets the loop in motion. The anxious thought arrives. This might not be good enough. Someone might criticize this. If this goes wrong, something terrible will follow. And that thought activates the amygdala's threat response, which activates the perfectionistic behavior, the checking, the revising, the second-guessing, the extending, the over-preparing, that constitutes the routine of the loop. Anxiety also functions as a maintainer of perfectionism through a mechanism called negative reinforcement. When the perfectionistic behavior, the additional revision, the extra preparation, the extended checking, temporarily reduces the anxiety, the nervous system registers this reduction as a reward. The anxiety went down when I did the perfectionistic thing. Therefore, when anxiety rises again, do the perfectionistic thing. This negative reinforcement, relief from an aversive state, is one of the most powerful learning mechanisms in neuroscience. It strengthens the loop with every repetition. Anxiety also warps threat assessment in ways that maintain perfectionism. The anxious brain consistently overestimates the probability of negative outcomes and overestimates the catastrophic consequences of those outcomes. And both of these distortions directly feed the perfectionistic demand for impossibly high standards. If the stakes feel enormous and failure feels likely, then of course the standard needs to be immaculate. The anxiety provides the distorted threat assessment that makes the perfectionistic response feel not only reasonable but necessary. Section 3. The perfectionism side of the loop. Perfectionism's role in the loop is equally essential, and understanding it requires the same precision that we brought to anxiety, because perfectionism is not simply a high standard. It is a specific set of beliefs, behaviors, and neurological patterns that generate anxiety as reliably as anxiety generates perfectionism. The core perfectionistic belief that drives the loop is the contingent self-worth equation. My value as a person is directly tied to my performance, not to my humanity, not to my inherent worth, not to my character or my relationships or the quality of my presence, but to my output, what I produce, how well I do, whether I meet or exceed the standard. This belief is the engine of perfectionism, and it is also the most direct generator of anxiety, because when your worth is contingent on performance, every performance becomes a referendum on your fundamental acceptability as a person. The stakes of every task are existential. Of course, the anxiety is intense. The threat is existential. Perfectionism generates anxiety through several specific behavioral mechanisms. The first is the setting of unachievable standards. Standards that guarantee a gap between performance and expectation, and that gap reliably generates anxious self-evaluation. The second is the cognitive distortions that perfectionism employs. All-or-nothing thinking that leaves no room for the good but imperfect, catastrophizing about the consequences of any shortfall, mind-reading the critical evaluations of others, and overgeneralization that converts a single mistake into evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Each of these cognitive patterns produces and amplifies anxiety. The third mechanism is procrastination, which is perfectionism's most counterintuitive and most anxiety-generating behavior. When the standard is perfection, beginning is the riskiest moment. It is the moment at which the gap between aspiration and reality first becomes visible. Procrastination is the perfectionistic brain avoiding that moment of exposure. But avoidance of anxiety, provoking situations, is the most reliable way to maintain and intensify anxiety over time. The task that is avoided grows in its perceived threat, the anxiety about it escalates, and the standard for what it would take to begin it rises. A vicious sub-loop within the larger loop that can paralyze people for days, weeks, or indefinitely. And post-completion evaluation is perfectionism's most insidious contribution to the anxiety loop. The immediate scanning of completed work for its failures, the inability to take in positive feedback without simultaneously cataloging what was insufficient, and the forward projection of what will be required next time to meet the standard that was not quite met this time. This is the behavior that explains the question I opened with. Why completing something produces not relief, but the anxious identification of the next inadequacy. The loop does not have an exit built into it. It has a continuation mechanism. Completion is not the end. It is the transition to the next cue. Section 4. How they lock together. The full loop. With the anxiety side and the perfectionism side understood, we can now map the full loop and see why it is so difficult to exit from any single point within it. The loop typically begins with a cue, a task, a deadline, a social situation, a performance context, or any stimulus that the brain has associated with the threat of evaluation. The cue activates the anxiety, the threat response, the physiological arousal, the urgency. The anxiety immediately activates the perfectionistic response, the elevation of the standard, the beginning of over-preparation, the mental scanning for potential failures, the planning for every contingency, the impulse either to begin with total intensity or to avoid beginning entirely. The perfectionistic behavior temporarily reduces the anxiety because it feels like control. If I prepare exhaustively enough, check thoroughly enough, revise completely enough, I can reduce the probability of the feared outcome. The anxiety drops briefly. The brain registers this drop as a reward, and the loop is reinforced. Anxiety activates perfectionism. Perfectionism reduces anxiety. The connection between the two is strengthened. But the anxiety reduction is temporary, because the perfectionistic behavior has not addressed the root of the anxiety, which is the underlying belief that worth is conditional, and the standard required to maintain it is one that can never permanently be met. The anxiety returns, often at a higher baseline than before, because the repeated reinforcement of the anxiety reduces with control pattern has sensitized the system to produce more anxiety in anticipation of its own relief. And when the anxiety returns, the perfectionistic response is activated again. The loop completes and begins again. Over time, the loop expands. The cues that activate it multiply. More situations are associated with the threat of evaluation. The standard extends from the original domain into new ones. The hypervigilance of the anxiety system flags more and more stimuli as potential threats. The routine becomes more elaborate. The over-preparation becomes more exhaustive. The checking becomes more extensive. The procrastination more entrenched. And the reward, the temporary anxiety relief, becomes less satisfying relative to the increasing cost of achieving it because tolerance is building. More effort produces less relief, which requires more effort. This is the exhaustion pattern. The person who is working harder than anyone around them and feels less accomplished, less satisfied, and more anxious than ever. The loop is not failing to work. It is working exactly as loops work, reinforcing the behavior and expanding the cycle in ways that are producing genuine harm. Section 5. Where the loop shows up: work, relationships, health. The perfectionism anxiety habit loop does not stay in one domain. It generalizes, and understanding the specific ways it manifests across different areas of life is essential for recognizing it in its full scope. In work and achievement contexts, The loop is most visible and most socially rewarded, which is exactly what makes it most dangerous. The perfectionist who works longer than anyone, produces at the highest standard, never submits anything that isn't exhaustively checked, is often celebrated, promoted, and held up as a model. The anxiety and the cost are invisible. The output is exceptional. The cultural reward structure confirms the loop's logic. Perfectionism produces results. Therefore, perfectionism is worth maintaining. What is not visible is the mounting anxiety, the narrowing window of self-acceptance, the burnout that is accumulating behind the output, and the gradual erosion of any intrinsic relationship to the work itself. In relationships, the loop produces its own specific damage. The perfectionist who applies the same impossibly high standards to their relationships, who expects of themselves and of others the same flawlessness they demand of their work, discovers that relationships, being stubbornly human, cannot meet perfectionistic standards. The anxiety about relational performance, am I a good enough partner, friend, parent, activates the same over-controlling, over-efforting, post-completion scanning patterns that the professional perfectionism produces. Relationships become performances. Intimacy becomes a threat, because genuine intimacy requires being known imperfectly, and imperfection, in the perfectionism anxiety loop, is the very thing the whole system is organized to prevent. In health and self-care, the loop shows up as the all-or-nothing pattern that sabotages sustainable behavior change. The perfectionist who begins a new health habit with complete commitment and intensity, who maintains it flawlessly until one imperfect day, who then concludes that the imperfect day means the whole effort is worthless and abandons it entirely, is experiencing the loop in the health domain. The standard was perfection. The performance was human. The cognitive distortion collapsed the gap between imperfect and failed. And the anxiety about the failure activates either a fresh attempt at a perfect recommitment or a complete abandonment that produces its own anxiety and shame. Section 6. Breaking the loop. What actually works? Because the perfectionism anxiety habit loop is neurologically ingrained rather than primarily cognitive, the interventions that produce durable change are ones that operate at the level of the loop itself, disrupting the cue routine reward sequence rather than simply providing insight into it. Here is what the research on both perfectionism and anxiety consistently supports. Disrupting the routine at the cue is the most direct loop interruption strategy. The moment the cue is recognized, the task arrives, the evaluation context presents itself, the anxiety activates, there is a narrow window in which the automatic perfectionistic routine can be replaced with a deliberate alternative. This is what Duhigg calls the golden rule of habit change. Keep the cue and the reward. Change the routine. The cue is the evaluation context. The reward the person is seeking is relief from anxiety. The question is, what alternative routine provides genuine anxiety relief without reinforcing the perfectionistic cycle? Self-compassion is that alternative routine, and the research supporting it is as robust as any intervention in the perfectionism and anxiety literature. Kristen Neff's studies consistently demonstrate that self-compassion reduces both perfectionism and anxiety more effectively than self-esteem building approaches, because self-compassion addresses the contingent worth belief directly. When the person can offer themselves the warmth and acceptance that good enough performance failed to earn through achievement, the loop loses its driving assumption that worth must be performed. The anxiety response to the evaluation cue drops when the evaluation's verdict, whatever it is, no longer determines the person's fundamental acceptability. Cognitive restructuring targets the distorted beliefs that perfectionism and anxiety mutually reinforce, the catastrophizing, the all-or-nothing thinking, the overgeneralization, the mind reading. Not as an insight exercise, but as a deliberate, practiced interruption of the thought patterns that generate the anxiety that activates the perfectionistic routine. The question is not just, is this thought accurate, but what is this thought doing in the loop? And what does addressing it directly change about the loop's next step? Exposure to imperfection, the behavioral intervention that is the most direct loop disruptor and the most uncomfortable to undertake, involves deliberately producing imperfect work, submitting things that are good but not perfect, allowing imperfection to be visible in contexts where perfectionism would have insisted on one more revision. The anxiety this produces is real, and sitting with that anxiety without performing the perfectionistic routine is how the nervous system learns that the feared consequence of imperfection, the catastrophic evaluation, the loss of worth, does not actually materialize. Each exposure recalibrates the threat assessment. Each time the imperfection is survived, the loop's reinforcing premise is weakened. Redefining the reward is the longer-term structural change. The loop runs because perfectionism produces enough relief from anxiety to constitute a reward. Sustainable interruption requires that the person develop genuinely rewarding alternatives to anxiety relief through control, alternative sources of the experience of competence, safety, and self-acceptance that the perfectionism has been providing inadequately. This is the deeper therapeutic work, not just breaking a behavioral pattern, but building the internal architecture, the self-compassion, the authentic self-worth, the tolerance for uncertainty that makes the perfectionistic anxiety relief less necessary. The worksheet in the description walks through the full loop for the person's own specific experience, mapping their personal cues, their specific routines, the relief that functions as the reward, and the interruption strategies that fit their particular pattern. It is designed for personal use and for therapists doing this work with clients in session. The perfectionism and anxiety habit loop is not a character flaw. It is a learned neurological sequence, built over time, reinforced by genuine short-term relief, and maintained by a belief about self-worth that the person who holds it never chose and very likely never examined. Understanding the loop changes the approach to it. Not, I need to work harder at being less anxious or less perfectionistic, but I need to interrupt the specific sequence at the specific point where disruption is possible, with a specific alternative that offers genuine relief rather than the temporary relief that perpetuates the cycle. That is learnable. It is practiced, not willed. It requires repetition and self-compassion and the patience for a nervous system that has been running a reliable sequence for years to learn, one disrupted loop at a time, that a different sequence is possible, but it is available.
And the people who build their way out of this loop consistently describe not just reduced anxiety and reduced perfectionistic behavior, but a fundamentally different relationship to themselves, one that does not depend on the next performance for its survival. The worksheet is in the description. Map your own loop, identify your interruption points, and bring it into your work or your clinical practice. Share this video with someone who has been wondering why trying harder keeps producing the same exhaustion. And I will see you in the next one.